We've all seen footage of Bruce Lee, but how well do you know his story? Filmmaker Bao Nguyen explores the man behind the icon in the film Be Water. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. 10 years ago, Bao Nguyen was my student at the School of Visual Arts in the MFA program for social documentary. He was a standout among many talented classmates. He went on to direct the documentary Live from New York on the history of Saturday Night Live that was selected to open the Tribeca Film Festival in 2015. Bao's new film, Be Water, tells the story of Bruce Lee through interviews with people who knew him best, including his wife Linda and his friend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
My last name is Lee, Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee himself was earth-shattering, respected, envied, even worshipped.
He had big dreams, big aspirations.
He knew he had something to share.
America was not ready for an Asian hero.
He was rejected. He had to show them that an Asian could be a leading man.
His very presence on screen is a protest.
People starting to react against the racism of the West.
He was trying to make the kind of films he wanted to make.
There were going to be people that would attack him.
You still think of yourself Chinese, or do you ever think of yourself as North American?
You know what I want to think of myself? As a human being.
I remember what it was like to be loved by him.
His philosophy was one of self-actualization.
He felt that everybody in the world might have a little bit to contribute to the canon of martial arts.
Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
We think of Bruce Lee as a star, but the film shows how he struggled in Hollywood when there was no place for an Asian American as anything but a sidekick. He had to go to Hong Kong to create the work that made him an international sensation before his untimely death at age 32. Bao has his own experience bridging the East and the West. His parents are Vietnamese refugees, and Bao was born in the United States. He reflects on his dual identity in his short film called Where Are You Really From?
On a regular basis, I would be asked the question, where are you really from? 7 years ago, I moved to Saigon, Vietnam. I had to stop myself from saying I moved back because technically I was born in the US, so I'm not returning to anything.
Today, Bao is living in Los Angeles, where I reached him by Zoom in December. It's been nearly a year since Be Water premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. The film was released on ESPN in June against the backdrop of mass street protests for Black Lives Matter. I've had past opportunities to hear Bao talk about his childhood. It gave me a deeper understanding of what he brings to the story of Bruce Lee. So I started by asking him to share a little of his own family history.
I was born in the US, but my parents came over to America in the late 70s. They were living in Vietnam at the end of the war. My dad was an officer in the Vietnamese army. They didn't make it with the first wave in 1975, but they came sort of the second wave of boat people in the late 70s. My dad, before they left, was in a re-education camp actually for 6 months. So that was one of the reasons he wanted to get out of the country with my mom and my older sister, who was 6 months old at the time. And so they went out after 6 attempts at trying to leave Vietnam by boat. On their 7th attempt, they finally got to leave the shores, and they were out on a boat for 2 weeks, not knowing where they were going to go. And they landed on the shores of Hong Kong, and they were in a refugee camp for 6 months in Hong Kong, and then sponsored to come over to America after that. And I was born a couple years later. So that's sort of my refugee story.
A very dramatic story. And I remember you described to me that your parents had a fabric store on the East Coast. Am I right? And then you kind of grew up around that. Can you give me just a little sense of what that upbringing was like?
Sure. I mean, looking back at it now and talking about it, it's basically child labor that they were putting me through. I was 5 years old when my parents had me work in their fabric shop that they opened. It was at the time I didn't. I was just like, okay, whatever my parents want me to do, and unbeknownst to me, it really sort of sparked my interest in visual arts, visual storytelling, because as a 5 year old working at a store for 8 hours a day every weekend, I needed some sort of stimuli, and this was before the time of iPads or my parents didn't really give me any toys to play with, so all I had was the back of these fabric invoices. My sister, who was 10 at the time, she was the one cutting the fabric, and so she would cut it, write up an invoice, and the customers would give it to me. And at the time, they thought I was just some cute little Asian boy that was just playing behind a cash register. But I would snap the invoice from them, and I would ring them up really quickly, and they were quite amazed by, I guess, my work ethic, to say the least. And but those sheets of paper were the only things that kind of kept me entertained through hours on end of not having anything. So I would take the blank side of those pieces of paper and I would sketch and draw stories and scenes all day. And I mean, looking back at it now, I was basically storyboarding. So my parents' forced child labor really played a big role in me wanting to become a visual artist, a filmmaker eventually.
Well, let me ask, in your growing up, when did Bruce Lee first become a presence to you?
Well, I was born in the mid '80s, so he had passed away, a decade earlier. So I wasn't watching Green Hornet or watching his films when they were out in theaters. Um, I I recall seeing Enter the Dragon, on a Saturday afternoon as part of, a double feature of kung fu films, right, that you get on certain channels. And at that time, I'd watched some films that had Asian American characters. The one that I recall the most was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And there's this character, Short Round, right? And he had a very thick accent, and he was sort of the comic relief and the sidekick to Indiana Jones. And I always wanted to be Indiana Jones because he was a hero. But the sidekick was the one that looked like me. So when I saw Enter the Dragon, I saw someone, who looked like me, relatively speaking, being the hero, playing the lead of his own story, and that was sort of it was an eye-opening moment, to say the least, because it was the first time I saw my reflection, right, in the screen, on the screen, and it really made me understand that I could be something more than what I've been told I could be for so long.
When you did go into film, I wonder what your hardworking immigrant parents thought of that.
Um, I mean, I'm still sort of convincing them in some ways what I'm doing. It's funny because, like, when I had Live from New York come out, was opened, the Tribeca Film Festival, as you mentioned earlier. It was, I mean, for people who have been to the opening of Tribeca, it's a big affair, right? It's at the Beacon Theater, and there's like 4,000 seats, and I wanted my parents to see that as sort of my introduction to my career, because it doesn't really get better than that, right? So I flew my parents were living in Vietnam at the time, and I flew them over, and a lot of these opening are like gala openings, so the ticket prices are quite high, but Tribeca is kind enough to give my parents tickets. But my mom, being sort of the entrepreneurial hustler that she is, she saw, like, the tickets are like $200, and then she started counting like how many people were in the theater. It's like 4,000 times 200. She's like, wow, Val's going to be rich tonight. And so that it was sort of a high bar for me for the rest of my career to kind of clear that I didn't want to tell my mom that's not how the business works. I wish it worked that way. But a few years later, I interviewed my mom for this short film that I did about my parents' journey, and my mom asked me, "Oh, when are you going to make a feature film about my story?" And I think that's sort of a benchmark to say that maybe they're finally proud of what I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah. So the Bruce Lee film, how did that come to you, or how did you go after it?
Well, after Live from New York came out, I was like approached, um, asking what I wanted to do next, and um, I think with this film, with Be Water and with Live from New York, they're examples of sort of like looking at cultural institutions, icons, American icons, in a slightly different lens. And having grown up watching SNL, watching Bruce Lee, um, and having seen documentaries made on these subjects before, I felt that me as a filmmaker, especially with a filmmaker with a slightly different, unique kind of upbringing to America, I could lend a reshaping of certain narratives, certain mythologies of America that I think would add value to the stories that might have already existed for a long time, and topics that people feel familiar with and have a connection with, but again, having it through a more personal lens. And at that time, 2015, there were really great documentaries about like Amy Winehouse and like Marlon Brando and Listen to Me, Marlon. And it was just like taking these larger than life figures and really looking at them on a intimate, personal, and humanistic level. And I kept on thinking about like, who would I want to approach in the same vein as that? Like, what icon do I feel hasn't had that sort of treatment in their story? And Bruce Lee stood out, for many reasons, as I mentioned earlier. He was, and sort of his symbol of representation was important to me. But I also thought, um, he hasn't been framed really, in my opinion, as an Asian American. He's always been framed as Bruce Lee is Bruce Lee, like transcends the idea of being Asian American, and he professed that he didn't want to be viewed as North American or as Chinese. But I think being Asian male in 1960s Hollywood, those identities were imposed on him too. So I felt like I wanted to do a film that views him in that perspective, but also views him in the context of the time that he was becoming Bruce Lee. Because I think it was really important to understand the struggles and the prejudice that he went through at that time. Because we all, I mean, not all of us, but there is assumption, there's a myth that Bruce Lee he just broke out into Hollywood and he was a great big star immediately without much struggle. So I wanted to sort of unpack that myth.
Well, so you referenced the Amy documentary and Listen to Me, Marlon. Um, Both of those films used a technique of audio interviews that allow the audience to kind of stay in the the con- the moment which those figures were living through the visuals, as opposed to bringing in a speaker who's now much older than the time that you're talking about. So that's a technique that you employ to great effect in Be Water. Um, I wonder, when you were, setting out with your list of people that you wanted to interview, who were you especially happy to get for this project?
For me, it was just having done the research about like the films that have been made before about Bruce Lee. I knew I wanted to set myself apart as having a more personal perspective. So talking to the people who knew him most intimately, right, and not having someone who's been impacted by him, by his legacy. There's the most previous documentary that was done about Bruce Lee. They had like Ed O'Neill talking about Bruce Lee, like Al Bundy. I was like, what do I need to learn about Bruce Lee through Al Bundy? No offense to Al Bundy or um, that documentary, but I knew I wanted to take a more personal lens, and that um, talking to people obviously who knew him close, like his widow Linda and his daughter Shannon, but also kind of finding the cross pollination between his stories and his networks, and his brother Robert is in the film. And Robert doesn't speak about Bruce very often, especially in projects that are English language. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is someone who people, it's a well-known fact that he had a deep friendship with Bruce Lee, but he hasn't been in a documentary about Bruce Lee in decades. And so I wanted to make sure that those stories were told, but also people who aren't so famous. I think one of my favorite interviews in the film is with Amy Sanbo, who's Bruce Lee's, first love in America, a Japanese American woman who was in an internment camp, and she really taught Bruce about the idea of being not just American or Asian, but what it meant to be Asian American. And I think, an immigrant coming to America in the 1960s, that's sort of a revolutionary idea, I would say. And so that I think that was really formative to who he became later on. And so, yeah, those the people that I spoke to could share with me intimate stories or the spirit of Bruce Lee. I mean, I tried to ask people, can you remember like when you had lunch with him 40 years ago, right? And I have to be fair to them and say, okay, well, I know you won't remember that story, but you can remember what the spirit of Bruce was and his personality and his hopes and dreams and things like that, what he talked about.
And when someone comes to a documentary about Bruce Lee, they, undoubtedly have a certain set of expectations about what they're going to see. Favorite film clips or um, that sort of thing. And I wonder how you were thinking about that, about what you were going to be delivering visually in this film.
Well, for me, I wanted to make it as personal as possible. And what it's great about those films that I mentioned, like Listen to Me, Marlon, and Amy, is like so much of the voice of that person is in the film, right? And we didn't have that luxury though. We didn't have like a treasure trove of home video like with Amy, and we didn't have 400 hours of like Marlon Brando speaking into a tape recorder. I wish I had that in Bruce Lee. It'd be amazing. So I really decided at first to like go through every piece of audio visual where he's actually speaking. It's his voice, and see how much of the spirit of him we can bring through those existing materials. And around that would be sort of the bones of the film. And then the interviews where we talk to everyone else, it's sort of the meat that we build the body of the film around. Yeah, but unfortunately, the bones were very scarce, and it shows that this is a man who died before he really became big, so there wasn't that sort of sense of like having a personal archive. I mean, I should say his archive was less audio visual and it was more sort of in writing. He wrote a lot, and I knew I wanted to include those writings in the film to be part of his DNA and his voice. And that's how the idea of having his daughter Shannon read those letters and poems and all his writings came about.
Am I right in thinking that you traveled to Hong Kong in the course of making this film to do some of the interviews there?
Yeah, I wanted to trace back all of Bruce Lee's steps and like again immerse myself in his world as much as possible. So that meant going to every city that he lived in, and that meant spending a lot of time in Hong Kong. I think again, like a lot of past documentaries have like focused on the American side, or if it's a Chinese language documentary, it's focused on the Chinese side. And I think we all, each country wants to take ownership over Bruce Lee. But I think he's very much a man of two worlds, right, of East and West. And I think that was an important part of the story. And so, yeah, going to Hong Kong was a great honor, and just talking to the people who knew him, and going, the Hong Kong Film Archives is a really amazing resource of film history and film preservation that I wish I could go back right now and just watch all these movies again. But it was very humbling to kind of walk through his shoes in Hong Kong.
I mean, I wonder when you were in Hong Kong and doing interviews with people there, if you got a different feeling for Bruce Lee than when you're doing interviews with people who knew him in the United States.
Yeah, it's funny. I think people in Hong Kong were much more open to talking about him without any sort of hesitation. Um, I mean, I should say, like, his second, he had these sort of different time periods where he was in Hong Kong, right? The first time period was when he was 6 months old to 18, and that was like his sort of child actor years. And then in the early 70s, 71 to 73 is when he made his return, and so that's when he was a superstar. And it was hard finding people who had that overlap, who were part of his world for both periods in his life. And so it was either someone who was a childhood friend, or there was someone who was part of his like sort of Hong Kong film entourage. But it's I always ask the question of like, did you feel like Bruce Lee was more American or Chinese? And like everyone, I mean, most people in Hong Kong said they felt he was more American, and then people in America said he felt more Chinese. So that perspective is interesting.
I'm curious when you watch the film today, if there's a scene or sequence that you feel especially proud of because you know how complicated it was to put it together, or you worked on it for a long time and took a while to get it right, or is there a scene like that in the film?
Yeah, I mean, there's several scenes, but I think the one that stands out to me is like the scene where we intercut like Bruce Lee's fight with Chuck Norris with Muhammad Ali's fight. And uh, I, I think I was fortunate enough to think of these scenes as like action scenes, right? They're set pieces in a way, and I was like, oh, I get to actually make like an action scene in a documentary, which is fun. I mean, there's definitely a lot of great documentaries that have that feeling as well. But to make sort of a all archival film with action sequence in between, with sort of this grand orchestral type of music, and being able to intercut between Muhammad Ali and Bruce Lee is sort of a fun exercise in filmmaking for sure.
So as the film has been playing for the last 10 months for some film festivals and on ESPN and in screenings like this one, um, what are the reactions that you've gotten that have meant the most to you?
Well, yeah, it's been a strange year to show the film, but I'm really grateful of the audience reaction, because for me the most surprising one was, especially like once the film broadcast on ESPN in June, how many families, multi-generational families, or like grandfathers would watch it with their granddaughters and their sons, right? And three generations would watch the film and talk about like what Bruce Lee meant to them personally, and then what they learned from watching the film together. I never thought I would make family films, but I'm pleasantly surprised about that sort of reaction. The idea, like that, the story of Bruce Lee can really connect different generations, especially in households where people have been stuck at home together with their family members, and this film was a way for them to connect as a family, and so that was really gratifying. And I think especially with there's been a lot of people who told me like, I always saw my dad watching Bruce Lee films, and he was always so excited, especially among Asian American families, because I think the idea of seeing Bruce Lee to a parent, a dad now, is sort of a similar feeling that when I described my first time watching Bruce Lee, and it's like the sense of empowerment and agency that you get seeing yourself reflected on screen, right? The real idea of why representation matters. And so, people younger than me would say, yeah, I finally talked to my dad, and, and he opened up more about like feeling disenfranchised or underrepresented when he came to America. But when he saw Bruce Lee, he felt empowered. And I think those conversations we don't typically have with our family members, because there isn't sort of a starting point for that. And I'm really grateful that the film had that way to connect people. Another thing was just the film, as I mentioned, came out in early June, and it was the end of May when the really brutal murder of George Floyd happened, and there was the racial reckoning, the much needed racial reckoning of America started to happen, and protests were going on all over the country. And um, I'm based in downtown LA, and that's at the time where a lot of the protests were happening. And so I would be promoting the film and talking about the film while there was these protests happening, and it was a strange time for me to be talking about Bruce Lee and Be Water when I felt like there were so many more important topics to talk about. But I got a lot of messages from like activists who were on the front lines and protesting, and they were like, it was such an inspirational um, break for us to watch Be Water, and it reinvigorated us in terms of like being authentically ourselves, and also like re-examining the sort of the lie. No, I shouldn't say lies necessarily, but sort of the horrific past and treatment of marginalized communities by America, not just by individuals, but systematically. And so it was really heartwarming to say, to hear those messages when people were saying like, COVID was such a grieving period, and George Floyd was such a moment of anger, of legitimate anger, and watching Be Water was this break and linkage in a way. Because I think also the film, given sort of the anti-Asian rhetoric that's been going on because of the pandemic and because of the outgoing administration's labeling of like the Kung flu or China virus, there's been a lot of sort of negative feelings and sentiment among the Asian American community, and a lot of feeling like, do we belong in America, or we've been sort of harassed that way, and reframing the American story and just showing like Bruce Lee as an American story, and not having to be Bruce Lee waving a flag, but just Bruce Lee being an American immigrant. It was very, for us, for myself, it really epitomizes like what I think is the best part of America, the idea that you can come from another place and you can bring the best of your culture, and it becomes the best of American culture and the best of American ideals. And I received a lot of messages from people about that, how it reaffirmed their stance that I'm American as well, even though I might not necessarily look like most or some American.
As I wind this up, I want to ask you about, what opportunities you see for telling Asian American stories today. You've had this wonderful opportunity to tell the story of Bruce Lee, but I suppose if we were to make a list of what Asian American stories were most likely to get out in the world, Bruce Lee would probably be at the top of it, near the top of it, anyways. And and I'm wondering, what you see as you think about other stories that you would like to tell, what opportunities you see, what challenges you see, what doors are opening, what doors are closed.
Yeah. So I think in terms of like the future of representation, especially with Asian American communities, there's one of my favorite poets is the Vietnamese American poet Ocean Vuong. He talks about how after his first book of poems was published and did very well, his publisher recommended that he did a memoir next, right? Because like as a BIPOC artist, the sort of mainstream community culture, they want to hear your kind of trauma and your past and your history in sort of a packaged, comfortable way. And so like Ocean responded, he's like, we as BIPOC artists are always expected to be like tour guides into our world, into our trauma, where we're not entrusted to be world builders. We're not entrusted to be artisans and craftspeople into building new worlds. And I think that's something that really resonated with me, because I think there's an expectation that we can only tell our stories, and we can guide people through, educate sort of like the masses about our traumas. But once it comes to like building a new story, a modern story, a different story, I think a lot of BIPOC artists aren't given that same room for potential that, to be completely frank, a white artist would be given. So I think not just kind of holding us to account of our experience, but also our potential, right? Lived experience is so important, but lived experience also helps us build and expand our potential for creating better stories, better worlds, more diverse and unique worlds. And I think having these uncomfortable conversations are just ways to make better art. And I think everyone in our industry should be striving for that.
I want to thank Bao Nguyen for speaking with me. His new film, Be Water, is now playing on ESPN+. This interview was originally recorded for Doc NYC. You can watch it on video, along with dozens of other filmmaker conversations, on the Facebook page for Doc NYC Fest. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Norden-Swan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphaela Nahausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. You can read our show notes and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.